This is a very exciting and enthusiastic crowd, so I'm pleased to welcome you tonight. My name is Cindy Passmore. I'm chair of the Graduate Group in Education, one of the many groups that have come together to bring this speaker series to you and this speaker tonight. So I'm the official welcomer to the Distinguished Educational Speakers Series, and also tonight this is part of the Critical Consciousness Speaker Series. So there's sort of two speaker series converging here. And that means there are lots of folks who are involved in bringing this together. So the UC Davis School of Education, the Graduate Group in Education, and the Alumni Council of the School of Education. And then also we want to acknowledge the Office of Graduate Studies and the Office of Campus and Community Relations. And I want to make a special recognition for the Social Justice and Education Committee and the hard work of the students whose committee that is, who made this speaker series possible and have clearly made this wonderful attendance possible as well. So I want to acknowledge their work. So to get started, I want to introduce Angie Cortez as the first person who's going to kind of give us a sense of what this talk is going to be about tonight. And so I'll turn it over to Angie.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelica Cortez, PhD candidate in the School of Education. My peers and I are very happy to have Dr. Solorzano with us, not just because of his extensive scholarship, but also because of his graciousness in sharing his experiences and background, as we believe he is an amazing scholar and mentor. I am speaking on behalf of the Social Justice Education Committee, and who, as Cindy mentioned, collaborated to bring Dr. Solorzano to share his knowledge with us. The Social Justice Education Committee is part of the Education Graduate Student Association at the University of California, Davis. We believe that a critical social justice education is necessary and a fundamental right for all students. We are committed to the implementation and institutionalization of critical social justice frameworks as they relate to advocacy, research, curriculum, courses, faculty, and recruitment of students, which cultivate critical consciousness in the School of Education and the communities we represent. SJAC is dedicated to creating spaces for sustained dialogue and collaboration with students, faculty, staff, and administration regarding the socio-cultural climate of the School of Education. And on behalf of the SJAC, I'd like to say that Dr. Solorzano, his work epitomizes the type of scholarship and dialogue SJAC promotes, not only within the School of Education, but campus-wide. As a critical race scholar, Dr. Solorzano is one of the pioneers bringing to the forefront discussions on issues of race and racism in education, as well as the intersectionality of gender, class, immigration status, and sexuality, among other combinations of oppression that people of color in this country experience daily. Discussing his articles on microaggressions and transformational resistance during the first ever critical race theory class offered in the winter quarter in the School of Education this past quarter, taught by Dr. Patricia has been life-changing. Intense in-class conversations led us to understand that it wasn't just one of us individually experiencing microaggressions, but rather many of us experiencing and witnessing them at different levels. For instance, I have personally experienced and witnessed instances of racism and microaggressions, not only perpetrated by fellow PhD students inside and outside of class, but perpetrated by faculty, staff, in the School of Education, and students in the credential program. To give an example, a common microaggression has usually been, well, those students are not doing well because some cultures just don't value education. Or a variation of this, uttered by students or written in their papers. And they were referring to students of color. Speaking with several of my colleagues, not just colleagues of color, we have found that these microaggressions are not uncommon in the different courses that we TA for, whether in the undergraduate or in the teaching credential classes. These assaults take a toll on us, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Graduate school is stressful enough as it is, but many of my colleagues and I have to deal with the added stress resulting from the microaggressions we encounter. This drains us of precious time and energy that could be better spent elsewhere. This experience parallels issues of race and racism that's still present at the institutional level within UC Davis. Just this past week, a group of student workers at the Coho, our student coffee house, planned a Cinco de Drinko, slosh ball party. This event coincided with the Cinco de Mayo celebrations, and as Dr. Adela de la Torre, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, stated in an open letter to the campus community, this event encouraged participants to wear stereotypical Mexican dress and depict images that debase the cultural identity of our Chicano Latino students, staff, and faculty. In response, students from across campus organized and protested the event. One of the outcomes of this organizing effort was that the group of students were referred to student affairs staff for cultural sensitivity training. While this event is symptomatic of ongoing and underlying issues of race and racism across campus, we call for an institutional level response to overt and covert forms of microaggressions, discrimination, and racism on campus. These are dire examples of the need for more critical consciousness, awareness of the scholarship, exposure to these issues, and having an honest dialogue would help foster the type of critical consciousness that would benefit not only the School of Education, but our entire UC Davis community and throughout every campus. We have no doubt that Dr. Solórzano will comment on similar events, as well as the importance of organizations like SCHEC. And now to further introduce Dr. Solórzano is Dr. Gloria Rodriguez.
I feel like that was a hard message to follow, right? I mean, it's hard to top that, and I'm always very humbled by the strength and courage of our students. So it brings a lot of meaning to all of us to be able to do this work and to share it with you all. So it's my distinct honor and pleasure to be a part of welcoming Professor Daniel Solórzano, our distinguished educational thinker and critical consciousness speaker, to the School of Ed and the broader UC Davis campus today. Indeed, it's important to recognize the accomplishments of this distinguished scholar, who also represents the cutting edge of scholar activism through his UCLA affiliations as a professor of education, a professor of Chicano studies, and a specialist in critical race and gender studies, as well as a critical educator, an LA Chicano, an outstanding mentor, and an exceptional human being. Muy bienvenida. To place Dr. Solórzano's stature as a scholar and educator in a national context, he has contributed with distinction to the field of education and with particular focus on the higher educational pipeline for Chicano Latino students as well as other people of color in the United States. Substantively, Dr. Solórzano has undertaken investigations that have illuminated the scope and depth of institutionalized racism and sexism affecting generations of people who continue to strive to access education and aspire to greater levels of educational attainment and mobility in education and our society. Part of this research trajectory has included his collaborations with scholars who have documented the various forms of cultural deficit model thinking that continue to shape and limit the discourse in education regarding the presence of communities of color in U.S. schools and society. In response to such characterizations and false depictions of their presumed deficiencies, Dr. Solórzano, along with his students and other collaborators, has set out to engage us with his analyses of the educational pipeline and how it plays out in the lived experiences of people of color, informed always by the application of critical race theory and conceptualizations of racial and gender microaggressions. I say with confidence that Dr. Solórzano walks his talk as a scholar whose practice is steeped in the pursuit of social and racial justice, sharing the CRT scholar's commitment to not just name problems of institutionalized racism and its intercentricity with other forms of bias and oppression, but to actually use one's scholarship to change these conditions for the better. For his enduring efforts to inform the challenges of diversifying our educational system through his research, he has earned the Derek A. Bell Legacy Award from the Critical Race Studies in Education Association, as well as the Social Justice in Education Award and the Carlos J. Vallejo Memorial Award for Lifetime Scholarship, both from the American Educational Research Association, or AERA. Recognized especially for his prowess in applying critical race and gender theories in the field of education, Dr. Solórzano was this year inducted as an AERA Fellow, an honor shared by those who have contributed to the field through a sustained record of excellence in research. Such professional strengths are further reflected in Dr. Solórzano having been the recipient of 2 Distinguished Teaching Awards at UCLA, one for his work in education and one for his teaching campus-wide. Having mentioned his strengths as a mentor to students and faculty, it is important to note that Dr. Solórzano also serves as the director of the UC All-Campus Consortia on Research on Diversity, or UC Accord, which he carries out with dedication to creating access to and success within our institutions of higher education for students of color and other diverse populations. Although my part in this introduction is to place Professor Solórzano's many contributions as a scholar into national context, I must share with this community how many of us have come to know and recognize him for his humble, deeply compassionate manner and steadfast belief in the strengths and wisdom of people of color and other groups who find themselves marginalized in our society. There is a special light in his eyes that appears when he speaks with admiration of his current and former students' accomplishments and their joint contributions to our fields of study. Sincere admiration for others that we seldom see among those who share the types of professional accolades that have been bestowed upon Dr. Solórzano. But it is, I believe, important to acknowledge his wisdom in doing so, as it reminds us that one does not fight effectively for social justice in isolation or with one's ego. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Professor Daniel Solórzano. Thank
you. Is this working? Good, okay. I think we're supposed to turn this off now. Wherever the young man is, okay. I don't think it's going to work, is it? You hear the feedback? Yeah. Okay. Is it off now? Okay. Now is it all right? Okay. I still hear feedback. Yeah, be careful, everything will go off. Is that all right? Okay, good. Well, thank you for this really gracious introduction. I still hear feedback. I'm gonna turn this off. I'm gonna turn this off. Let's see if they didn't turn this off. Nope, they turned this one off too. Is it no? How about now? No? I might as well just go with this one. Okay. Thank you, though. I appreciate it. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight and hearing some of the work that I'm sharing on racial microaggressions. The title of the presentation, the title of the talk is using the tools of critical race theory and racial microaggressions to examine everyday racism. And so hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm gonna walk you through, share with you some of the research we've been doing over the past years. Now it's close to 20 years, but also to share some of the most recent work that we think is sort of moving the work in a really positive direction. How I came to study racial microaggressions? Well, it actually begins, as some of you who know me know. I mean, in 1993, I was at East LA College. I'm going to move over here if you don't mind. Maybe that'll be fine. I was at East LA College, just at the library, just conducting research, just looking for different articles and magazines. And I like being in libraries, so that was an amazing place for me to be. It still is. I still like to hang out in libraries, as many of you know. And I came across this article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And the article was on June 23rd, 1993. It said, critical race theory questions the role of legal doctrine in racial inequality. And it basically, there was this one paragraph here, one line here that said, these scholars, or the scholars who are known as critical race theorists, have for a decade been producing startling analysis of racial inequality. I had never heard of them. I had never heard of critical race theory, right? And so when I seen this article, this newspaper article, I realized that something was happening that I needed to engage in. I need to read about. So I asked my chair at the time, it was Marv Alkin. I asked Marv, my chair, if I can take a sabbatical. In I think it was at that time it would have been not the fall quarter but the winter quarter, and I basically spent that winter quarter and time before that just immersing myself in that literature. So I immersed myself. This was pre-digital time, so I immersed myself in the law library with a Xerox card and using old bound indexes to find research on critical race theory in the law. And so I basically, that's where it started. It started with that article at East Los Angeles College, in my reading and interpretation of that article. Because two things happened. One, I realized this was really important, and that we in education had to get on board or find out what was happening to see if it affected our field, or how we can impact, or how we can participate in this discussion around critical race theory. And two, I said, sounds familiar. This work really sounds familiar. And the familiarity of that work was really the work that I've been doing for years in ethnic studies, race and ethnic studies. And so those two came together, and that's what started me on this journey in 1993. I'm not going to go into all the history, but if we can be here for a couple of hours or days, I'll tell you about a little older history, but I'm not going to do that right now. And so my working definition of critical race theory, and this sort of has been ongoing and evolving over the years, just to set the context. I say that critical race theory is the work of scholars like many of us in this room, who are developing an explanatory framework, because that's what theory does, right? It explains phenomena. It's a tool that we use to explain phenomena in whatever field we're in, that accounts for the role of race and racism in education. That's what we try to do. We try to account for the role of race and racism in education. Furthermore, CRT and Ed works towards identifying and challenging racism. So we not just identify it, but you push back, you challenge it in its various forms, in its historical and contemporary forms. And so this is something new in the definition. I'm really focusing a lot of my work now on the historical forms of racism and how we can identify them and use them in our work, but both in our research and our pedagogy and our curriculum, etc. As part of a larger goal of identifying and challenging all forms of subordination. So this intersection of oppression that Gloria had mentioned earlier in her introduction. So this is the working definition. It changes, it evolves when I meet with students, when I meet with colleagues like yourselves in this room. So it's an evolving, it's an organic definition that will hopefully keep changing as long as I'm doing this work. But how did I come to know racial microaggressions? That's another term I had never heard of. And so when I was in that library, those libraries, trying to find articles on critical race theory, I came across this article in the Yale Law Journal by Peggy Davis called Law as Microaggression. So that's the first time I'd ever heard the word microaggression. First time. But something clicked, something made sense to me. This was back in the, right around 1994, 1995 when I first came across this piece. And I came across this part of the article, and it says in section 2 in the scene below, will be analyzed from the point of view of a black participant and as an instance of incessant, often gratuitous and subtle offenses defined by black mental health professionals as microaggressions. Right? That's where I first seen the term used. And so I looked down to, as you can see, footnote number 5. I came down to footnote number 5, Chester Pierce. Right? And there's an article here called with Wesley Prophet, Homoracial Behavior in the USA. It was a 2-page unpublished manuscript that I really never found until recently. I finally found that manuscript, that unpublished manuscript. I mean, one of those things you have to find it, right? And I finally found it. But again, this set the stage right here, this piece right here, this article, because I went back and I looked at her references, and there are numerous references of Chet Pierce's work. So I did like many of us do. I read everything that Chet wrote. And I continue to read everything that Chet writes, and I reread it because I find new things in his writing that I guess it all depends on where you are at that particular point. But Chet's been really helpful in forcing me to rethink my ideas around racial microaggressions. So I want to recognize Chet Pierce. Chester Pierce is an emeritus professor in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University, and he's also an emeritus professor in psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. And so he's retired now, but he still remains sort of an important person for my work, but also my students who have contact with Chet over the years in trying to get feedback on some of the work that we're doing. And so this is the definition that launched my definition on racial microaggressions. This is part of an article he wrote back in 1974, and he said, what the reader must bear in mind, he's given us a working definition here, and I'm always looking for tools to help me do my work. What the reader must bear in mind is that these racial assaults to black dignity and black hope are incessant and cumulative. Any single one may be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in this country is offenses done to blacks by whites in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. These offenses are microaggressions. So there he's given me a definition, a way to define this concept. And so I took the definition, and this is how I define it now in the work that I do. And again, this is a working definition, so it's evolving. But I say that racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism. Now, this is my sociology training coming in. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, so I have to bring in society and how society, in its various forms of race and racism, how it affects the way I define concepts. Used to keep those in the racial margins in their place. It's just one tool to keep those in the racial margins in their place, these ideas, these concepts of racial microaggressions. So racial microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal assaults, right? Using Chet's definition. Chet really didn't talk about the nonverbal assaults until later, when he talked about in articles that came out later. But I think nonverbal assaults can be just as negative on a target of that assault than a verbal assault. And so we're looking a lot at nonverbal assaults at the moment, directed towards people of color, often carried out in subtle, automatic, or unconscious forms. And I say here often because they don't have to be subtle, automatic, or unconscious. They can be very overt, these microaggressions, as you'll see in a second. What I want to emphasize here, though, is that my work focuses on people of color. That's the work that I do. I don't look at how other groups, whites in particular, how they experience microaggressions. Other people do that work, or how they, as either perpetrator or target. And I would recommend that if you want to do that work, there's a colleague of ours at Columbia University, Teachers College, Daryl Sue, does some amazing work in this area. And I would recommend his work and the work of his students and people who now are doing some of this work. I mean, they do that work of looking at whites and people of color because they're in a counseling program, a counseling psychology program, and they're looking at dyads, counseling dyads. So you have to look at the perpetrator in that context, I would argue. I just don't do that work. So at the end, if there's any Q&A about whites in this particular work, I'll try to answer, but I'm not the expert in this area. I would reference you to Daryl Sue. The second part of this definition is these are layered assaults. So they can start with one's race, but they also, you can layer in one's gender, one's class, one's sexuality, one's language, one's immigration status, phenotype, accent, surname, or college type. And you might wonder, why did I put college type in there? Well, we have a colleague down at UC Santa Barbara, a doctoral student, who's looking at how students generally, but students of color in particular, how they experience transfer microaggressions when they come from a transfer institution onto a four-year campus, and some of the things that people say about them as transfer students. So she's looking at some of that work, and I want to acknowledge some of that work. I think it's really powerful and important work. We hear it all the time. I've been hearing it since I've been here today from different students talking about their experiences as transfer students at UC Davis. And then finally, they're cumulative assaults that means they just pile up over time on people. And they take a physiological toll, a physical toll on one's health. They take a psychological toll on one's health. And they take an academic toll on one's academic attainment or success. So again, this is my definition. This is what guides the work that I do. So why microaggressions? In the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was part of a team that was led by Walter Allen, a sociologist at UCLA, who's now at UCLA in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Walter was leading a team of researchers that were expert witnesses in the Grutter v. Bollinger case that early 2000 ended up being adjudicated in 2003, that affirmative action case, the law school case, right? And so we were experts. And as part of that expert testimony, we went into University of Michigan and did campus racial climate studies. And we went to the law school and the undergraduate campus to do these studies. But we also looked at the main feeders into the law school. What undergraduate campuses were feeding into the law school? So we went to Michigan State, and we went to Harvard, and we went to Berkeley, and did similar racial climate studies. And those reports became part of the court. We delivered them to the federal district court in Detroit, Michigan, back in early 2000. But what we would do, they would ask us to come back and share our research with the community. They're in Detroit, they're in Michigan. And so we would often come back and speak to high school students or college students or community members. And there was one particular time, we went back to University of Michigan and we were presenting some of our research. We had just finished our presentation, then people were queuing up on the lines for Q&A. And a young high school student, Detroit high school student, she came to the mic and she stood there and she started crying. And it was uncomfortable. I can only imagine how uncomfortable it was for her, but it certainly was for us as well, because we didn't know what was happening, what she was feeling, what she was going to say. But when she finally said something, this is what she said: "You've given me a name for my pain." A young high school, we turned out later she was 14, 15 years old, but we had given her a tool to name what she had been experiencing as a young person. And so for us, it was reaffirmation that the work that we were doing was important, and we had to continue this work. Recently, the I2M Harvard sort of campaign that some of you may have heard about, although that's not where it starts. It actually starts at other institutions. Fordham University in New York City was one of the first spaces that had these I2M campaigns. But I guess because it was Harvard, it got the national media attention, as you'll see in a second. This is Kamiko Matsuda Lawrence, a Harvard sophomore, who basically directed this project. Some of you may recognize the name. She's the daughter of Mari Matsuda, one of the founders of CRT, and Charles Lawrence, again, an amazing two legal scholars who were instrumental in the development of critical race theory. And this is their daughter, who's basically a leader there at Harvard in this particular effort to talk about, engage their community around issues of everyday racism or racial microaggressions. This is their webpage, and you can see there's amazing sort of examples of how people are talking about everyday forms of racism in a very simple way, a very powerful way, right? They basically take this whiteboard and type it right into it, and then put it in front of them and take a picture. I mean, that's one of the best public service announcements I've ever seen for racial microaggressions, right? And now it's being done all around the world. People are using this tool to bring this issue to the forefront. But again, it doesn't surprise me that students at the forefront of these efforts. Absolutely. It's not the academics. Believe me, it's not the academics. It's the students. And I applaud them and other students, not just at Harvard, but at other institutions who are moving forward in this way. And so those are examples of the go to their webpage and check it out. It's really a powerful sort of presentation. And so in March 22nd, I'm going to go forward a bit. Actually, the night before, on March 21st, this article came out online. This was a Friday night, right? Thursday afternoon, I had a meeting with one of my colleagues at UCLA, and his advice to me was I should start to tone down my discussion of racial microaggressions. And we had an interesting, we disagreed obviously in our conversation, but you know, for his own reasons, he felt that this was only making things worse. And so, again, we disagreed. But that night, the next night, Saturday night, on the New York Times website, they had this headline, said, "Students see many slights as racial microaggressions," by Tanzina Vega. Right? She wrote the article. The next morning, this article came out on the front page of the New York Times, lower left-hand corner. They didn't use the word microaggressions, but she said, "Everyday slights tied to race add up to a big campus topic." And what she was talking about was this I2M Harvard campaign. That's what she was talking about in the article, and the power of that campaign. And so,
microaggression is an
I'm going to go back.
term.
And so if you go to their website, you go to the New York Times website, you'll hear, you can link into a 5-minute video talking about this effort, this I2M Harvard effort. I'm going to share with you just a small snippet that I think is really critical. But I was going to say something else that I forgot, and I'll get to it if I have to come back to it. So here's a small snippet. Let's make sure we have enough sound on this.
Microaggression is an academic term that's been around for decades. But recently it's taken root in social media campaigns as students across the country are questioning whether their generation is indeed colorblind.
It's important to have the vocabulary to be able to describe your lived experiences in order to feel like they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them. We have to show that these little daily microaggressions are just sort of the little bubbling up of greater racial tensions that are underlying this whole post-racial, if we have this post-racial surface, there's all of these extreme racial tensions underneath the surface where people are oh, we have a black president, we're post-racial, but...
So you can get a sense of what she's saying. Some really important things she's saying. I remember what I was going to say. If you went to that website that night at the New York Times on the 21st, and you start looking at the posts, after 13 hours, they had over 650 posts. They had to shut it down, and I was able to capture all of them. I kept them all. Data, right? And so, because many of them were very negative, many were very negative posts. So again, that's another way in which we're communicating, and they're reaffirming racial microaggressions in many of the posts. That you go to some of these websites, their website in particular, the I2M Harvard website, and you see some of these negative posts that are popping up in that site as well. And so I just want to share that with these young women. So again, what she's saying is that it's good to have the vocabulary to describe your lived experiences in order to feel that they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them. I mean, that's another way of saying, you give me a name for my pain, that young high school student shared with us 13 years earlier, right? But we keep getting that message from people when they hear about the research, whether it's faculty members or students or community members or high school students, middle school students are using this term in various ways, as we're finding in some of our research. But you know what she said? She said something different. I like the sort of the description that she said. Basically, that racial microaggressions are those bubbles that come to the surface. But they said that below the surface, I'm putting words in her mouth, or institutional racism, right? All this bubbling underneath. But that's exactly what happens. When people see the microaggressions come to the surface, or something happens, they try to dismiss it. Well, it's just that class, or just that person in that class. But what it represents, the way Matsuda Lawrence was saying, is that basically it's all this underneath that's basically coming up. And sometimes it explodes, right, in various ways. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we deal with these issues in the everyday, wherever we find them, whether it's in a classroom or a club or any kind of space that we engage in. And so this is the model we use to study racial microaggressions. So racial microaggressions take place within this context of institutional racism, right? And so we look at institutional racism in its various forms and how it impacts on racial microaggressions. And so you have a perpetrator and you have a primary target. I study the primary target. That's the work that I do, okay? You also have secondary targets. People who the microaggression isn't directed at, but certainly feel the sting of the microaggression, right, in the everyday. We had some examples in a discussion we had earlier with the students around the secondary forms of microaggressions that people experience. They may not be the primary target, but they're hearing things, seeing things, and it's affecting them. An example of why and maybe it's a cop-out or sell-out, but why I don't study the perpetrator, it's frustrating at times for this reason. You recognize this quote? It says he's the first mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. Most of you probably know who's it about? President Obama. Who said it? Joe Biden. In the 2008 Democratic primary, right? This is what he said. And basically, Barack Obama, his response was that he doesn't know his history. There are other African Americans that came before him that ran for president. But again, you see this. I'm assuming that Joe Biden meant this as a compliment, right? Barack Obama asked him to be vice president. But the bottom line is that it depends how you interpret that, right? I'd love to talk to President Obama and ask him about that particular quote, maybe do some research about how he interpreted it, how he felt about it, although we may hear in a second how he felt about it. But again, one of the challenges is that the primary target responds to the perpetrator in various ways. Sometimes we don't do anything, but sometimes we do respond to a comment like that, right, to a microaggression. And the perpetrator says, well, that's not what I meant. Or the perpetrator says, but I meant it as a compliment. Or the perpetrator says, you're being too sensitive, usually about race or gender. Or it was just a joke. Get a sense of humor. We've heard this over and over again in our research. Okay? And so this is one of the challenges, and I think I'm hoping someone in this room or other rooms is going to find out what is this all about? You know, why is this happening? Daryl Sue deals a little bit with that in his work, but I think it's research that needs to be done. Why the perpetrator responds in this way as a result of an initial microaggression against a person of color in this particular context. And so, types of microaggressions. This is the model we use to study microaggressions. There are types. Some examples of types that comes from our research. When I talk about those blacks, I really wasn't talking about you. Probably meant to be a compliment, right? All right. But the bottom line is, who's those blacks? Who are they in that context, right? Or how does the person on the receiving end of that interpret that so-called compliment? You're not like the rest of them, you're different. Again, meant to be a compliment. I don't think of you as Mexican. Right? You speak such good English. But you speak without an accent. You're a credit to your race. How do black people feel about, and then you just fill in the blank. I mean, it may happen after this event. Or how do Latinos feel about, and then fill in the blank. So the context, where do these occur? So we're giving you an example of types in various ways. Context, walking down the street. It happens when you walk down the street and you engage with people or don't engage with people, right? People may not get out of the way or may force you out of the way in a particular context. It happens in malls. It happens along the malls, but it happens in the stores often, right? It happens, this idea of being hyper-visible. I mean, you walk into a store and you're being followed around the store, right? Thinking that you're going to take something or you're going to pilfer something. The other invisibility, hyper-invisibility, is you walk into a space and they ignore you. As you're like you're not even there, right? So I would argue that's a microaggression as well, and how you interpret that. It happens in classrooms. Here at Davis, at UCLA, in many classrooms around the country, right? Not just those two institutions. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to go back to Chet Pierce. And I'm going to go back to an article he wrote, a chapter he wrote called Offensive Mechanisms. And that's one article that I would really recommend that you take a look at. It's one of his first articles where he talks about racial microaggressions. He initially called them offensive mechanisms, right? But again, it's a really powerful piece of work. And I can give you the citation after. But this is Chet Pierce talking in that article, talking about his experience with racial microaggressions in the classroom. This is what he said. He said, I notice in class I teach that after each session a white, not a black, will come up to me and tell me how the class should be structured or how the chairs should be placed or how there should be an extra meeting outside of the classroom, etc. One could argue that I'm hypersensitive, if not paranoid about what I know every black will understand is that it's not what the student says. It's in this dialogue, it's how he approaches me, how he talks to me, how he seems to regard me. I was patronized. I was told by my own perceptual distortions, perhaps, that although I'm a full professor on 2 faculties at a prestigious university, to him I was no more than a big black nigger. I had to be instructed and directed as how to render him more pleasure. So when you talk about racial microaggressions, you talk about how we experience them in various spaces, I think Chet is telling us exactly what he feels and what he's experienced in these spaces, right? I would recommend a book if you haven't seen it or haven't started reading it. We've been reading it in my research apprenticeship course, my RAC, for the last since January. It's called Presumed Incompetent. And basically, it's the stories of women of color, women academics of color in various spaces, including classrooms. I'm actually encouraging our Office of Diversity at UCLA to really encourage our faculty and our students to start reading this book and holding reading groups. Really, really important. This happened all around the country right now. So I'm not new in telling you this. But again, it's important. Right after the George Zimmerman trial, when he was acquitted, if you remember, there was a lot of concern in the community about what was going to happen after that verdict was rendered, how people were going to react, how the community was going to react. I have to tell you, I wondered if things would get really bad after that verdict. It seemed to me as a pretty cut and dry case. And after the verdict, I think within hours of the verdict, maybe not, maybe the very next day, President Obama had a press conference. He only talked about this, right? And he only basically for 17 minutes, he came before the podium and basically said a number of words to the country about this issue. And this is what he said.
But I did want to just talk a little bit about context and how people have responded to it and how people are feeling. When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened to you. I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away. There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. And I don't want to exaggerate this, but those sets of experiences inform how the African American community interprets what happened one night in Florida. And it's inescapable for people to bring those experiences to bear. The African American community is also knowledgeable that there is a history of racial disparities in the application of our criminal laws. Everything from the death penalty to enforcement of our drug laws. And that ends up having an impact in terms of how people interpret the case.
There's so much in that segment, so much in that segment. We can analyze that segment in so many different ways. All the microaggressions, he didn't call them microaggressions, but he's referencing what we call microaggressions. The issue about disparities in the criminal justice system, there's so much in that, and it's historic because I don't remember a president ever doing anything like that, right, publicly like that. And you can see the pain in his voice. President Obama, he doesn't often talk about race, and he's been criticized for that. This is one time when he stood up there and started talking about this very difficult case and sort of personalizing it. And so I applaud him for doing this. But again, I'm a researcher, right? And so I'm looking at this as research. I'm looking at it, unfortunately, I have to do this. I do this often. I see this as someone given us examples of what racial microaggressions look like in the everyday, right? So we talked about the types, the context, the effects. How does it affect people on the receiving end of those racial microaggressions? It's obviously painful. They hurt if you're on the receiving end of them. You get anger. It adds stress to your life, your everyday life. It's what my colleague William Smith at University of Utah calls racial battle fatigue. You experience racial battle fatigue. And again, his work I think is really critical and really important in how people are affected by everyday forms of racism, the work of William Smith. You doubt yourself. I mean, you'll see in a second how you can be in a situation like this, here at Davis or UCLA or at Harvard, and you doubt that you should even be there. I mean, that's the effect it might have on students or faculty or people just in various spaces. It affects your academic performance. Poor health outcomes. It eventually affects your physiological health, the way in which your body responds to this everyday racism. And so I'll give you another example. This is Unnatural Causes. This is a 7-part program. I think it's a 7-part program. You probably have it here in your library. I recommend that you use it in various ways. But if you only look at one episode, you look at number 1, in sickness and in wealth. Because they're looking at the intersection of race and class and how that affects people of color in the United States. And for this segment, you're only listening to two experts, at least two experts, Abigail Troutman, who's the director of the Louisville, Kentucky Department of Public Health and Wellness, and S. Leonard Syme, professor of epidemiology at UC Berkeley. And what they're talking about is they're talking about the effects of race and racism on health outcomes. So this is what they say.
And poor or not, if you're not white, the prognosis can be worse. I'm clear that on the social gradient, that line that we talked about earlier, that I'm on the top of that line. How old are you? I'm highly educated. I have a medical degree. I have several degrees. I make good money. I live in a good neighborhood. But I know that according to the research, if you're an African American, no matter what your social status, your socioeconomic status, your health outcomes are going to be worse than your white counterpart.
African Americans die earlier and have higher rates than whites of many chronic diseases across the social gradient.
Why should there be an elevated risk of disease in African Americans of higher social class? Bad genetics. Not true. When you look at other countries where the discrimination is not as prevalent, you don't find those kinds of rates. So something's happening.
As a physician, I've been followed around the store when I go in to buy something. I've been looked at as scanned, so I've seen a woman grab her purse when I come into the elevator, and for goodness sakes, I am Dr. Troutman. Why this shouldn't happen to me, but it does.
The whole idea of vigilance and the burden that it takes to be constantly on guard over time really does change biological markers and make people vulnerable to getting sick.
Racial discrimination can be an added stressor, linked with high blood pressure, increased rates of infant death, coronary artery disease. Troutman knows what this can lead to. He authored a cornerstone study with former Surgeon General David Satcher on excess death among African Americans.
It was a national study, and we found over 83,000 excess deaths per year in the African American community alone.
83,000 excess deaths each year. That's the equivalent of a major airliner filled with black passengers falling out of the sky every single day, every year.
Sort of a powerful way to talk about the effects of race and racism on the health outcomes in the African American community. Once again, Troutman is talking about the everyday forms of racism and how it affects him. The elevator, the elevator keeps coming up in people's stories, by the way. In other spaces, where in stores and walking down the street. But this is, I think, a powerful indication of the effects, and I would recommend you use it in various ways in your classrooms or in spaces to talk about the impact of race and racism on people's health outcomes. Syme says this. He said, why should there be an elevated risk of disease in African Americans of a higher social class? Because that's what Troutman is. He's a medical doctor. He's a member of a professional class. Bad genetics, because often people say it's genetics, right? Not true, he says. When you look at other countries where the discrimination is not as prevalent, you don't find these kinds of rates. So something's happening. Well, that something is racism. He's not saying it, but again, if you listen to the program and read into those comments, it's about racism, everyday racism, and how it impacts people of color, in this case, African Americans. Troutman says, as a physician, I've been followed around the store. We talked about that earlier. When I go to buy something, I'm looked at askance. I've seen a woman grab her purse when I come into an elevator. And for goodness sakes, I'm Dr. Troutman. You know why? This shouldn't happen to me, but it does. So it transcends social classes. Racism transcends social classes, I think, what the message is there that Dr. Troutman is sharing with us. Let's move over to that event that we were talking about earlier, the I2M Harvard event, back in March, that one that Tanzina Vega was referencing in her article in the New York Times. This was the event. It was Friday, March 7th at 7 o'clock. They were premiering a part of the 10th anniversary of the Walter J. Leonard Black Arts Festival. And basically, they were going to share what I shared with you earlier, these examples of everyday racism. And by the way, Kamiko Matsuda Lawrence, this came out of a class that she was taking in the English department and African American Studies there at Harvard. And it was her project. She had interviewed 40+ young women and men at Harvard. And based on those interviews, she came up with this idea, this play, and this way of sharing data in a very powerful way. And so Patricia Williams at Columbia University, some of you know her work. She was one of the women mentioned in that article I shared with you earlier back in 1993. She was one of the founders of CRT, Critical Race Theory. Patricia Williams basically said this about that event and about that website in The Nation magazine 2 months ago. She said, she's talking about those students, those African-American students at Harvard. She said, they are treated with open disdain. The champagne flute snatched from their hands at cocktail parties as they were mistaken for waiters. They were figured as criminals when they walk across the campus, Harvard campus. Their sexual prowess is interrogated. Their beauty is denigrated. They hesitate. They hesitate before asking questions in class, for a dumb question from a white person isn't heard as a reflection of all white people. But any question from a black person tends to be scrutinized for the inherent inferiority, proof that the student's lonely little voice is the evil marker of where a more qualified white person ought to be sitting. I don't think anybody said it better than Patricia Williams. I mean, I've heard people talk about this, but this is one of the most amazing sort of set of lines that sort of get at that issue of when someone happens to a person of color, you represent all people of color or your respective group. You know, often whites aren't burdened with that don't have that burden on them. And I don't think sometimes white or professors, including professors of color, we don't understand that. We fall into this trap as well when we see our students, unfortunately. And so responses, those are some of the effects. What are the responses to racial microaggressions? We deny them. We deny they exist. You know, there's an example down in Los Angeles with the Donald Sterling, the president of the LA Clippers incident, and that young woman, Vanessa Viviano, I think her name is, the young woman, Steviano. She basically, if you've been reading the accounts of this, she went on Barbara Walters, I think last week, or was it last week? And she basically said he's not a racist. Donald Sterling is not a racist, and I'm not sure why people are saying that he's a racist. I would say that's denial. I mean, she can have her interpretation, and she's part of this process, but it sounds like denial to me after what, if you followed the case, the kind of things he did prior to these comments he made on tape there in Los Angeles with his rental properties in Southern California. This thing called racial realism, this Derek Bell's sort of concept that racism isn't going away. It's here to stay. We have to deal with it in that context. And often when you hear African Americans and Latinos, especially around this Donald Sterling case or other cases, they'll say something like, well, that's just the way it is. We've got to deal with it. I would say that's racial realism in action. That's how people respond. We self-police. We don't go to certain places. You know, we don't go to certain restaurants. We don't go to certain stores. We don't go to certain other public spaces. We don't want even the thought of having an incident take place. It happens with my family. Some of you have heard this story before. With my father-in-law, at least, if we have a birthday party or some sort of family function, there's really only three restaurants we go to for those functions, because we know we're going to be treated well. The food's good. One of them is a little restaurant in East Los Angeles called Teresitas. We know the food's good there. We know we're going to be treated well. Right down the street, there's another restaurant called Liliana's. We know the food's good there. We're not going to be treated well. And there's another restaurant in Chinatown called Hop Lee. And that's it. So if we're ever having a birthday party or something like that, we're going to be in one of those three places if you're looking for me. But the bottom line is we know that we don't want to risk. My father-in-law is one, if something happens, boy, he is going to get right in that person's chest. And, you know, try singing happy birthday after that, right? and he's known for that. And so we choose our places. We police ourselves. And people often do this. And in our research, we find how people do this, how they police themselves when going to various places. We want to prove them wrong. That's another response. We're not like that stereotype. We're not like those folks how blacks are supposed to act, or Latinos are supposed to act, or Asians are supposed to act. We resist. We push back in various ways, organizationally, individually, etc. Racial socialization. We raise our kids in a certain way. There's an article that came out right after the George Zimmerman trial by Sandy Banks, the LA Times op-ed writer, on the second page of the LA Times, and she said, she basically wrote this letter about how to raise black boys, black men in LA, and basically how you have to tell them when you're pulled aside, when you're pulled over by the police, your hand should not leave the wheel. That's racial socialization. We're socializing our children to deal with everyday racism that they might experience, because moving quickly can be deadly, right, in certain communities. So it's a powerful article that I recommend it to read. We form counter spaces, organizational spaces. The space that you described earlier, Angelica, I think could be considered a counter space in many ways, right? We have various art forms. You know, I over the years I've been studying public art, mural art as a way to respond to everyday racism, and there are examples of this all through the country. But certainly where I grew up in Los Angeles, there's a real strong tradition of public mural art in the Latino community and in the African American community. So I think that's an example. Music. I mean, that's another example. Humor is another example. We're studying right now some of the humor of Dave Chappelle, looking at that as an example. Not all of it's the best example, but we're finding some really good examples to use in our pedagogy, to teach. But there are others. I'm going back and looking at some of the old Richard Pryor works, Moms Mabley works. I mean, there's some amazing ways in which comedians have really, it protects us. It allows us to deal with the everyday forms of racism that exist. And so this is, I think, really critical. I have a student right now who, she took my seminar last quarter, a couple of weeks ago, and she's in the World Arts and Culture / Dance program. She's a doctoral student there. And she's looking at how dance, using critical race frameworks, in an amazing way. And I had no idea what she was going to be doing, right? And then I get this paper at the end of the quarter. We've been meeting now, because she's doing an independent study with me right now. And so we're trying to figure out how, I wish I knew, it's called CI, if anybody is in dance. That's what she calls it. I wish I remember the name. But it's an amazing way of looking at critical race theory and dance, merging those two fields. What can we do? Chet Pierce gave us an example. He basically told us in 1974, he's talking about blacks, but I think this probably is applicable to other folks as well. He said the black must be taught to recognize microaggressions and construct his future by taking appropriate action at each instance of recognition. So recognition and action, that's what Chet is basically telling us. Now, this looks differently depending on your context, right? Recognition is one thing, action something else, right? You have to be very careful about action. Responding to everyday racism in various contexts might not be the... I'll give you an example, a personal example. I was at the LA Union Station catching a train down to San Diego. And it was at a time when the Lakers were better than they are now, the LA Lakers. They were a very good team at that time. And I was waiting for the train at the little bar there in the train station. And there were a bunch of young men that were there after work. I guess that's a little watering hole right there at the station. And they were watching the basketball game. And me and my wife were sitting down at a table. And they started using the N-word over and over again because they were responding to what was on the screen. Now, I recognized what was happening. The question is, what was the appropriate action? Right? I mean, one action would have been to go up and tell them that, you know, I'm a critical race theorist. And I'm not sure how that would have ended, but you know, I could have said it in various ways. I could have dealt with it in various ways. And I chose maybe the option that I still, as you can tell, to this day, I still worry about the option I chose. My wife, Laura, said, let's get out of here. Right? Let's just get out of here. So we just got up and left. And I felt bad by just getting up and leaving and not saying something to somebody. But yet, so I'm not sure if I took the appropriate action. I still don't know. But that happens every day when people are experiencing this. And then you go home and you say, God, I should have said this. Why didn't I say that? Right? You know, and you start to sort of prep yourself for the next time. That was one time that I'm not sure I took the appropriate action. I'm still talking about it. So, and so if you look at the MTV has a new campaign that I think started within the last couple of weeks. It's called Look Different. And you might want to take a look at this website. It says MTV's Look Different is here to help you erase the hidden racial, gender, and anti-LGBT bias all around us. We'll help you unlearn biases, open up conversations with family and friends, and always give you specific things you can do to make things better. Now, if you go to the website, it's an amazing website. It's developing. They have a whole section on racial microaggressions. They have a new section that came online, I think, a couple of days ago on the Clippers, the Donald Sterling case. So they're constantly updating it for examples. And I think it's worth looking at it, taking a look at it as one appropriate action to everyday racism that Chet was talking about. I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to go through. This is the first time I've shared this with folks, right? And there's a lot of text here, and I often don't like to use a lot of text, but I think this might be important for this context. In April, the U.S. Supreme Court came down with a decision called Schuett versus Bam. Schuett was I believe he was the head of, not elections, what do you call it? Secretary of State for the state of Michigan. And he was the defendant in the case because Michigan has a proposition they filed back in, I think, in the early 2000s that basically eliminated the use of race in admissions, contracts and grants in the state of Michigan, similar to our Proposition 209 in California. So people were looking at this case to see how it was going to play out. The decision came down in April, and I would recommend you read the decision. But I'm going to share with you the dissent. Because often dissents become majority decisions down in history. It might not be in my lifetime, but in someone's lifetime. And I think this dissent by Justice Sotomayor is a really powerful dissent. And again, as a researcher, I'm looking at the language, and it's amazing, this language coming from the court, from the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. She says, the question that the court was asked to answer was, does the amendment, that proposition in Michigan, to the state's constitution to prohibit race and sex-based discrimination and preferential treatment in public university admissions decisions violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? That's the question the court had to answer, right? They answered no. They said it doesn't. So that proposition remains part of the state constitution in Michigan. So that's why we're looking to see whether this might affect Prop 209 here in California. But here's what Sotomayor said. She said in this long 50-plus page dissent that was the decision was 6-2. She was on the losing side, along with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Breyer switched his vote, went to the other side, and Justice Kagan had to recuse herself because I think she was a Solicitor General when this case came initially before the court. So this is what she said. She said, race matters. Now this is coming from the Supreme Court. Again, I keep reminding myself this. Race matters in part because of a long history of racial minorities being denied access to the political process. Race also matters because of the persistent racial inequality in society, inequality that cannot be ignored and that has produced stark socioeconomic disparities. She goes on to say, and race matters for reasons that really are only skin deep, that cannot be discussed any other way and that cannot be wished away. Race matters to a young man's view of society when he spends his teenage years watching over others tense up as he passes, no matter the neighborhood where he grew up. That's a racial microaggression. Right? No footnote. Race matters to the young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, no, where are you really from? Regardless of how many generations her family has been in this country. Race matters to the young person addressed by the stranger in a foreign language, which he does not understand because only English was spoken at home. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling of thoughts. I do not belong here. She finally says, in my colleague's view, meaning the 6 votes in the affirmative in this case, examining the racial impact of legislation only perpetuates racial discrimination. This refusal to accept the stark reality that race matters is regrettable. The way to stop racial discrimination, to stop discrimination on the basis of race, is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race. Again, I'm going to repeat that. Is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race. That's what we don't do. That's what we don't do. Right? And I think she's, again, leading us as only a Supreme Court justice can do, but I think other people have been leading us as well. Derek Bell, many folks. And apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. As members of the judiciary, tasked with the intervening to carry out the guarantee of equal protection, we ought not sit back and wish away, rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our society. I mean, that is a powerful dissent. I don't think I've seen anything like this, because I read court opinions, and I don't think I've read anything quite like this. I mean, I like the Bakke dissent, if you've read the Bakke dissent. That's the Justice, who was that, Brennan's dissent. I think he was the first writer on that dissent. I actually like Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson. You go back and read that dissent. This one, it's amazing. Just what's there. I mean, there's so much there to be analyzed, to be used, to be captured, to be engaged with, discussed. And so, in the end, I would argue that how as we as a community, here at UC Davis, where I'm at UCLA, but the broader community, how can we as a community recognize and take appropriate action when we see and or engage in acts of racial microaggressions? That's what I want to leave you with today, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion, an engaged discussion around these issues. So I want to thank you. Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Yes?
Do you think it was a good idea to completely take Donald Sterling out of the NBA or whatever? Do you think it was good that he was taken out? Because I feel that it would have been good to, instead of just taking out that one person, actually have a discussion about racism and deal with the problem instead of just taking off that one person and just forgetting about it.
Yeah. Here's where, if you've been listening to folks talk about this, I think it's a good idea that I think he had to leave. I actually do think he had to leave. But I think what's happening now, people are discussing race because it has to do with sports. I mean, people get really excited and engaged when talking sports. In LA, there's a lot of conversation about this right now, this case. A lot of conversation. So I actually think it's a good thing. I'm not sure if it's as historic as people are saying, because, you know, in LA, you know, there's a book that just came out recently by Ed Soja, one of our faculty members at the Urban Plan at UCLA. It's really a memoir about his growing up or coming to Los Angeles. And he argues in this book that there was an event that really changed LA. forever. And that was what he called the Watts riots, back in 1965, right? And so one could argue that he's probably right. That really changed Los Angeles. It really changed the way people dealt with each other. It still has effects. People still talk about it, right? You build it up to the Rodney King incident back in 1992-3, whenever that happened. That's another event that really affects, that he talks about, Soldier talks about in that book. I'm not sure how he's going to see this, because this is something that people are using to talk about, right? About and I think, unfortunately, that particular incident, I'm not sure if anything would have happened if he'd been talking about anybody, some guy on the street. But if you recall, he was talking about Magic Johnson. So he talked about this icon in basketball generally, but certainly in Los Angeles. And so I think that's why things moved the way they did so quickly. I mean, you know, because he'd done some things, if you look at the history of Don Sterling, he'd done some things in the community that were just outrageous, absolutely outrageous, but nothing ever happened.
How do we, as scholars and in our writings, address who is responsible in speaking towards and holding the institutions accountable? Just for say, in that instance, the NBA easily just put it on Donald Sterling, even though we know the NBA can easily be a racist institution. Or here at UC Davis, they're recommending the students go to sensitivity training, while at the same time, San Jose, the student was expelled. And so what do we do to address the institution's role?
Well, I think, I mean, there's, I guess, a number of ways to answer this question. One of the ways is that as students or as faculty or as just a community?
Well, I guess specifically for me, what would help is as scholars, maybe in our writing, in addressing these particular gaps, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that again, getting back to Chet Pierce's recognition. Recognition can take multiple forms, and one of the forms is that you write about these issues. You get your message out in various ways. I mean, as I said before, our scholarly articles don't have the punch that I think this I2M Harvard efforts have. I've talked to folks who do student affairs work, and I've often told them, because when they ask me, okay, what should we do? Because it's happening, I was just at the Claremont Colleges talking to the deans of the 5 colleges there, deans of students social services and their counseling staffs. And I told them, I go, you know, one of the things that, I mean, let's get creative about how we approach this. And I actually, this was before this happened, I actually referenced the PSAs, public service announcements. I mean, sometimes just a poster or a 55-second sort of PSA that goes out publicly to in a college or in a university or in a space can be really powerful, right? Just the message that's going out. And I think that part of it is, you're asking how we as academics can do. We can work with students and work with community members and work with folks to get those messages out, to recognize and take appropriate action, as Chet Pierce was talking about. That's one way, I would argue. Yeah?
You had many examples of racism in the book there. As Professor Microaggression, how do you think about voter disenfranchisement that's been happening in a lot of the states around the country? I'm originally from North Carolina, well, my family lives in North Carolina now, and we've been having this big thing about how voters are getting disenfranchised, and I've been saying all across the South, East, and North. So what are your thoughts on how that's going about?
Well, I mean, that gets at structural racism, institutional racism, right? But it affects people in the everyday. I'll give you an example. North Carolina is probably a good example, because North Carolina now has, and I have a slide that I can't pull up right now. North Carolina now has a driver's license that says on the driver's license, if you're undocumented, you're not unlawfully here or something, not legally here or something like that. So every time you use your license, and you know we use it all the time, right? Every time you use your license, the person who looks at it knows you're undocumented, right? That's happening in the everyday, and that's institutional. They're in North Carolina. Other states are trying to do the same thing. Here in California, that's not going to happen. At least for now, it's not going to happen. I mean, we're barely giving license to undocumented folks after years of political efforts by communities in the state legislature. But they're in North Carolina. That's a good example of how in the everyday, just pulling out your license and it's saying that you're undocumented. The impact that has on the person, that has to do that in the everyday, I think is powerful. Now, the voting rights issues is a similar issue, right? Where, you know, under the guise of protecting us from people who would vote illegally, you know, the very small percentage who would, we're taking away sort of opportunities for people to vote, a much larger group to be able to vote. I think those efforts have to be challenged. Getting back to your question, both by because I know some of my academic colleagues are challenging in our writings, their writings, the political scientists are challenging those types of efforts, both in the academic community, but also getting that message out into a larger community. We often don't get credit for that as academics, to get our work out into a much broader community. But yet I know some of my colleagues are doing just that. I mean, I can name a couple. Mark Sawyer at UCLA has been doing some of this work. Down at Berkeley, Lisa Garcia Bedoya is doing some of this work as well. Mm-hmm.
So as an alumni of UCSB, this past year there was some students in their academic senate that drafted a proposal to faculty asking them to put trigger warnings in their syllabus about race. If you're going to talk about race and racism, not only did you have to put a trigger warning, but if students chose not to attend that day because that is possibly going to be a challenge for them to discuss and talk about, such as white privilege, that they were excused and they would be given a supplemental activity outside of class. I was just wondering your thoughts on that. As someone that teaches race and racism, yes. I just couldn't even imagine having to put that in my syllabus, but I was just wondering.
Well, obviously, I'm against something like that. I mean, yeah, because I'd have to be putting trigger warnings. Many of us had to put trigger warnings every week.
Right. How would you, I guess, take action as a new faculty member against something like that?
As a new faculty member who, well, again, I'm not sure if I would do it individually. I would mobilize other faculty members to work with me on this one. Because I think, I mean, there's probably a lot of our colleagues, allies, who would really help us in this effort to push back against a policy like that. Did it actually come to be, or?
It's still floating around. I think it was struck down by, I mean, UCSB has a very interesting population. Yeah. And I think it was struck down by the students this past year, but from what I understand, they plan to have it on the ballot next year. Yeah. And the faculty, I think, are just kind of like, let the students be, but students have been known to be very powerful at Santa Barbara. So,
I mean, UCSB is an interesting place, right? How many places can you go to a basketball game? And I'm not sure if it's before the game begins or at halftime, where people throw tortillas on the court.
Yeah, that's before.
Is it soccer? Okay. I mean, soccer games. I mean, that talk about a microaggression, right? I mean, but yet that happens. And for some reason, you know, the university doesn't stop that, can't stop that. I mean, I don't understand that. I mean, it troubles me to think that occurs in that place. But I hear about it all the time from my colleagues.
We have time for one more question.
I'm so happy to see such a big turnout here today. It's really exciting. Also, I know that there's a lot of different institutions that are represented in this room. And so I know that you were called to head a task force at UCLA to really be proactive in regards to diversity training stuff. Could you just talk a little bit about what you're doing at UCLA and what your task force entails?
Well, there's a lot happening at UCLA right now. I mean, some of you may have heard about back in October 15th in the fall quarter, there was a UC-wide external group that came in and did an analysis of faculty bias against other faculty at UCLA. It came out with the Moreno report. That came out on October 15th. Not too long after that, the Black Bruin video, some of you have seen that. It's a really powerful video of young black males and how they experience race and racism at UCLA came out. In our department, or actually in our school, the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, we had an incident in one of our classes that went public and went viral that we had to deal with. In the winter quarter, the video from the law school called 33 came out. Another very powerful video that you probably should take a look at. It talks about that at UCLA Law School, of the 1,100 students in that law school, there are only 33 black students in that law school. So they talked about what they experienced in that law school, talking about many of the microaggressions that we talked about here. And likewise, so did the Black Bruin video. So the university is moving to try to bring about some sort of change at the university level. They have a task force that's meeting and coming up with recommendations that will be UCLA-wide. At the Graduate School of Education, because of the incidents that were occurring in our school, it actually happened, the incident happened, I think it was in November. I'm looking at Nancy because we were having breakfast in St. Louis at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you said there was a text and that something was happening at UCLA that day. And it was students had taken over a class. And so that sort of escalated. But the media on that just went viral in terms of the way in which they negatively portrayed the students who actually took over the class. For a half hour, by the way. It wasn't the whole class. And so what happened is that our school we felt we had to do something, or something had to happen. And I'd say within about a week or so, the dean sort of asked me if I would chair a task force, or chair a committee, the Committee on Race and Ethnic Relations, that would address some of the issues that the students had raised, not just in that class, because we don't want to use the class as the only instance. We realize that it probably is much deeper than that. It gets back to those bubbles down here. That just percolated to the top. And so what we did is that he asked me if I'd chair this committee. I agreed to chair it, but I agreed to chair it only if we have students on the committee, because the original sort of charge was just going to be faculty. And as I was telling some of you folks earlier, is that one area that I think we missed in that report is that we missed staff. We didn't include staff until recently. We realized that we made a mistake and we had to include staff, because it's staff that often deal with students on these issues in the everyday, often much more than we as faculty do. And so they're now part of this committee. Monday, we just submitted our second report to the school, and we're recommending, we're coming up with some recommendations. And part of the reason why I think we're pushing ourselves to do something is because we're already in week 6, right? This committee is scheduled to end on June 30th. Well, all the students are going to be gone. All the faculty are going to be gone. But we wanted to sort of come up with something that we as a community can feel good about in terms of what the next steps would be. So we came up with 7 recommendations to the dean and to the 2 chairs and to the chair of the Faculty Executive Council, Executive Committee, FEC. And so basically, the first, I won't go through all 7, but the first one I think is really pivotal. We're asking for the establishment of an associate dean for equity and diversity that will deal with these issues, not in the short run, in the long run. This is not going to go away. We think we can be ahead of this. And so that dean, whoever that associate dean is going to be, but we wrote all kinds of things that she or he has to do into that portfolio. So I'm not sure who's going to want to do it. But again, if we find someone, I mean, I think it's going to be a really powerful position, because I think she's going to have resources. One of the things that happens, and for the faculty here, I mean, you know, if someone comes to my office and has a charge of sexual harassment, I know what to do. I have cards for the chief sexual harassment officer right on my desk. I've been trained. I get trained every, I think, 2 years, year or 2 years, trained in sexual harassment, how to deal with it, how to mitigate it as a faculty member. Well, what do I do if someone comes with a racial bias or racial harassment? You know, what do we do? Well, I send them to the chair, right? Well, we feel that we have to do something different. And I think that's happening university-wide now. People are having that conversation, not just in the School of Ed and Information Studies, but also the law school. I just met with some faculty in the School of Arts earlier in the week, right before I came here, in fact. They're talking about this too, basically coming up with some way in which to deal with grievances that students have in the everyday. And so that's another part. We're putting together a grievance process as part of the second recommendation that this dean, associate dean, will have to deal with. There's others, professional development, professional trainings for not just faculty, but for students and staff. I think there's a pedagogy piece here that I really want to encourage and push, and because I think the way we talk about race and racism in our classrooms, the way we engage with race and racism in our classrooms, we need some work. We all need work, myself included. And so, and I learned so many things today just talking to students about the kind of things they do, the kind of ways in which they deal with race, both in this space but also in their K through 12 spaces as well. So those are a couple of the things.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.